Welcome everyone to OK Transmit. We're an art and technology meetup based here in St. Pete, Florida. And tonight we have the honor of having two special guests, Tina Piracci and Kenny Jensen, who are both artists working at the intersection of art and technology and nature. And I think there's going to be a really interesting kind of overlap and yet some differences in their practices that they'll talk about. So stay tuned for that. I'm just going to give a quick intro to OK Transmit. We are now running on about 2 years of art and technology meetup. We were kicked off by the Arts Alliance through a small grant. And so we're really grateful to the Arts Alliance. A lot of people have helped us along the way, and I'll show some thank yous in a minute. But okay, what is this all about? Basically, we're just a meetup, a free and open meetup where people are invited to come, artists, technologists, scientists, people who are just interested and patrons of the arts or sciences. And we talk a lot about art and technology practices and the sort of interdisciplinary nature of those practices. It's a really diverse community. I think we're at about 180 members now, and we get when we were sort of going in person prior to the pandemic, we had a good range of people showing up all the time, and people were bringing projects. Sometimes we do open salons and critiques where people would bring works in progress or prototypes. It was just a lot of fun. And so really we're in the spirit of kind of teaching and learning and transforming and shaping the future of creative expression through art and technology. Things that we are exploring together. This is just kind of a snapshot, but really it's, new kinds of materials, different methods. Sometimes they're old methods reimagined, and different kinds of modes of expression. And so that has kind of shown up in these talks and meetups as everything from immersive art to robotics and rapid prototyping, all different sort of walks of, traditional craft reimagined, like sculpture and painting, glass. We held a lot of these meetups at Duncan McClellan's Art Glass Gallery. And and it continues to expand. Of course, we kind of treat technology here as another medium in itself, and as if it were glass, wood, metal, or some other media. And our sort of growing list of people we should be thanking who've helped us out along the way. I mentioned the St. Petersburg Arts Alliance. We kicked this whole thing off with a small grant and bought a projector and started doing the meetups. Duncan McClellan's gallery hosted us for many meetups, and it was a lot of fun to come there, and very inspiring environment to be. And if you haven't been, please visit. It's in the Warehouse Arts District in St. Pete. And then, Suncoast Developers Guild, the Ringling, University of Tampa, so many, and some of the open source collectives like Processing P5JS and more. So here are some places to connect with OK Transmit. We are online. We're on meetup.com, and that's where we send out the invites and post upcoming meetups. We have a Facebook community as well as being on Instagram. And so you're always free to share things you see kind of out there in the world that inspire you, that are at the intersection of art and technology. And we use the hashtag OKTransmit. So that's a little spiel on OK Transmit. And now I'm going to do an introduction of Tina Piracci, who's here from Berkeley, California, visiting, originally from Florida. And I'll give a small bio on Tina before handing it over for her talk. So Tina Piracci is a current candidate for the Master of Science in Architecture at the University of California, Berkeley, with an emphasis on technology and sustainability. And I actually probably should say graduate, because you're about a week from graduating, so congratulations. She obtained her Bachelor's of Fine Arts degree from the University of South Florida with a concentration in sculpture extended media, and 3 minors, including electrical engineering, digital fabrication, and entrepreneurship. Additionally, she studied abroad in both Paris and London, and is now residing in Berkeley, California, where she serves as a research affiliate at the Berkeley National Lab, while she balances her coursework, teaching, and of course, her own arts practice. So each project for Tina is an experiment, and she strives to merge art with technology. And so we'll hear a little bit about that practice. Welcome, Tina. I'm going to stop screen sharing and hand it over to you.
Thanks for the intro. And thanks for inviting me today. So I'll go ahead and screen share. I've put together a variety of images. It's kind of a lot, but I wanted to show a wide variety and sort of tell a narrative of where I've been and what kind of work I'm working on now. So some of it's in progress, some of it's complete. Um, but yes, I'll be graduating in like 10 days. So I'm really looking forward to that. I'll talk a bit about my thesis, as well as the overgrown collective that we're installing at Fairgrounds currently. Um, so yeah, go ahead and get started. So I thought it'd be a nice intro to sort of talk about why I decided to go to Berkeley. So there was a group called Emerging Objects, and essentially that group was through the architecture department. Originally, I was looking at their MFA program, and their architecture department had a lot of natural materials printing, like this bird's nest, for instance. They were all sort of projects that were philanthropic in some kind of way. So these were bird's nests that were created for Cassin's auklet, these birds that were in decline because of erosion. So we were able to ceramic 3D print these forms that were strong enough for a sea lion to sit on them. So basically, the erosion sort of takes away the habitats for these birds. So this was a way of sort of implementing something that they would be hiding from predators, because often they'll burrow. So it was 3D printing nests like this. And this one was another model. So these were on Año Nuevo. I also did field work on that island, got poked by a sea urchin, which I have plenty of urchin-like things in the installation that we're doing now in Fairgrounds, probably inspired by this experience. So it was also a collaboration with CCA, where they were also hand building these nests. So there's the Cassin's auklet there. Some other projects included these coral restoration seeding units. So with clay printing specifically, which is what my focus is in, there's a lot of applications in science and environmental and just different applications that utilize the material of clay, because unlike other methods of clay printing, the method that we use is FDM, so it's fused deposition modeling. So it just sort of layer by layer stacks up the clay. Here's another version. So this is a sodium bicarbonate print. So essentially this was an ongoing series with Emerging Objects, who I worked for as a researcher when I came to Berkeley. And these were, I think there's something around 2,000 of these objects, and they're in Curacao in Mexico, because ceramics have been shown to host coral larvae very well. So this is sort of, I think it was a few months in, sort of starting to grow, and we keep getting updates from them. A part of the research that we did there also included the development of this software. So Potterware is a software that allows people that don't have a whole lot of scripting experience to use clay printing. So this here was developed with Potterware, so it's like radial designs that allow for looping and different texture patterns, which for me, pretty much everything you make in Potterware, if you're using this coiled feature, just speaks to nature so much, because it kind of looks like a pine cone. It kind of has these radial designs that allude to sacred geometry and other things like that. So this is like the interface. If you are interested in getting into clay printing, this would be the way to do it if you don't want to learn programming. Not getting any kind of benefit from advertising for it, but it is like a really simple program to allow you to just sort of adjust different things. You can upload an image and sort of make an embossment from that image, and then it creates the G code for you, so you don't necessarily have to script it from scratch. So this is the interior of the cup. So different patterns can have a beautiful aesthetic, but also depending on what application you're using, they can also be implemented in the science fields or different things like that, whether you need increased surface area for coral larva growth or circulation with different perforations, which I'll talk more about later. So this was like a series that Emerging Objects did with potterware to sort of exhibit the different patterns that you can get from it. And then so I'll share a little bit about our group work. So Overgrown is the collective that we started in West Berkeley in a studio. It includes Barak Darwish, Adam Hutz, and KJ Wu. So this here is Core Sample. This was an ongoing experiment that we did with Ann Taiwan. So it was a research experiment where we were sort of playing with these different elements from soft robotics. So these are just the renders, electromagnets, and trying to play with these notions of technology and nature and where they might overlap. So we had real growing mushrooms, elements of soft robotics, and we sort of installed this in like a woodland area in Berkeley. And I have a short clip of it that I can skip through. But essentially here's the acorn sort of levitating and the light ring sort of calling out this portal in a sense, because a lot of the themes in our work is sort of trying to call out to another world in a way. So it's not necessarily the same place or time as where we are currently, but sort of alluding to this portal or imaginary world. Skip around a bit. And different pneumatic elements oak trees are sacred to them, and so for us, this was sort of like this last piece of it. So it's beautiful symbolism because though our work often is thinking about all the sort of damage, but like the interactions that humans cause and what that might lead to in the future, we always try to keep this element of hope. This idea of we can make a change and we can sort of change our ways so that way we don't end up entirely. So I'll go ahead and skip forward. So another element of my research at Berkeley, less fine art, but still sort of expressing that motion of entrepreneurship and philanthropy. So to be brief, Potters for Peace is an organization, nonprofit, that creates these water filters. They have hundreds of factories all over the world, and the ceramic body allows the water to filter through. It has a silver colloidal glaze, so the ceramic body itself can filter out anywhere between 94 and 98% of the bacteria and pathogens, whereas that silver colloidal glaze can get the remainder, so that way it's up to like 99.88% effective against different coliform and things like that, because like the two leading causes of death in the global south include, and they're completely preventable, is household air pollution and water sanitation. So this is one of the factors in Ethiopia, and so they're doing the water filter testing. So the part with Potters for Peace is that it's difficult to open one of these factories because the ram press that they need to sort of get the filters to be created is around $20,000. So that's like a big hurdle for a lot of these organizations, but it's still something that they're able to do through grants and other things. So this is a map of the existing Potters for Peace specific filter factory, but they have been branching out, and then companies train other people. So there's sort of this ongoing cycle of water filter factories, but these are the specifically Potters for Peace ones. So here you see the ram press, and that's the machine that costs so much. So in our proposal for my thesis, for instance, we're proposing to print them instead, because there's a lot of issues that come into play with the ram press filter. For instance, they have to use plastic as a mold release. And with that, a lot of the countries have outlawed plastic. And so they either can't access it, or they have to get it in sort of sketchy ways, and it needs to be a renewable resource. So the idea is to use these creative toolpathing strategies to recreate the filter. And right now, the studies that I'm doing at the lab are sort of exploring how different toolpaths can even improve the filter further, because a lot of the filters, around 15 to 20%, get discarded because they're not up to par. So here's an illustration of different toolpaths that we're experimenting with. So the lines that you see is the path that the printer takes to sort of deposit clay layer by layer. And we're finding that we can sort of prescribe these different preferential flow paths with the water filters through printing. And then potentially we can reduce the amount that's discarded. So this is also the second part of my thesis. It's cook stoves. So we recently received a grant from Brillo it's in support of the UK International Department of Development. And so what we're trying to do is create cook stoves with the 3D printers as well. So here you'll see Ashok Gadgil. He's a member of the National Berkeley Lab, and he has sent out around 50,000 of these stoves to Sudan. It started during the genocide, when there were many that were displaced. And so essentially, one of my research partners received one of these stoves when he was a child, and his mom still cooks on it to this day. But the project has stopped and it's fizzled out because there's high tariffs and taxes on things that are coming into the country. So we wanted to, in a sense, teach a man to fish, so that way we can keep it a sustainable design. So the partnership that we're doing right now with that grant includes recreating the Berkeley Darfur stove, as it's called, to create a passive injection system where combustion sort of allows the heat to circulate naturally within the stove. So we were able to reduce the amount of biomass being used. So that helps with deforestation, it helps with carbon emissions, and it helps create jobs. So with this CCC group, the Clean Clay Cook Stove, you'll see Logman over on the right. And then the other researcher is Sandy Kurth, who is now doing his PhD at MIT in computational design. So here, for instance, is the script that goes into making one of those stoves. Right now, we're redesigning it in a way that accommodates the traditions of the area. So we'll be making it a little bit shorter and making some modifications, so that way we make sure that it's accepted to the region. So the idea is to implement this training program. And with clay 3D printing, essentially the most important parts are things that they already do, which is firing and clay processing. So the idea is to train them on filling the clay tubes, because the files will already be prototyped and tested and developed, essentially, to where all they would have to do is fill the clay tubes and then print. So we plan to also send extra parts and offer remote support through our groups, but that'll be launched in January of 2022. And then back into a little bit more of the artistic realm, I wanted to introduce some of my older artistic work. So a lot of my pieces earlier were dealing with anatomy, the body to express different stories. So here you'll see an ear that was sort of expressing my experiences within, I guess, art school in general, and just sort of like inflation and ego and different things like that. Whereas on the right, this is about 4 feet tall and is actually now in my parents' yard, but it has moss growing all over it. And it's a peace symbol, but it's missing the middle finger because, let me open the chat real quick. Oh, yeah. Oh, cool. Eric is here. Hi. So it's covered in moss and it's growing. So it's missing a finger because my uncle Felix and my father were both drafted into the Vietnam War. And when they were drafted, neither of them wanted to go. And my uncle Felix completed his term and then he got called back for another term, which was totally unfair. And, you know, he was faced really difficult times and he was contemplating suicide and doing terrible things like that. But instead, he blew off his middle finger as a way to evade the draft. And for me, this is like his symbol of peace. And he passed away a few years ago. So for me, this is sort of my, I call it Ode to Felix. And then once I started getting into 3D printing, here you'll see a raku hand sort of smashing a plastic failed print of scissor hands. So it's sort of like this rock, paper, scissors play. And the top hand is like clay that I made from scratch with glaze that I made from scratch, to sort of symbolize that even though I'm dabbling in all these technological art forms, like I still respect all of the traditional forms. And I don't think that, you know, printing is superior in a sense, which is kind of ironic because I think everything that I've been doing since this work has been either printed or digital in some kind of way. But I feel like this is my way of sort of holding on to those things that I value the most. And so one of the first classes that I took that inspired the first kinetic work that I did was inspired by MC Escher's drawing hands. So this idea of self-creation was really important to me because, you know, when you're trying to pick what degree to do, what should I do for the rest of my life? It's just like, I feel like our generation in particular is sort of given this like notion of you can do anything. And I think for me, that was really inspirational because it became this self-creation notion. So I tried to recreate that with these pieces. Unfortunately, I don't have a video because I lost that data, but essentially these sort of like pivot and they have a wireframe structure on the inside of the silicone and they're molds of my own hand. So it's sort of like screwing these screws that are in the wrists of these sort of robotic hands. So it's kind of like this self-reflective work of self-creation. I also did this series of projection on the surface of skin. So it was sort of like this digital light skin with a tracking rover. So then I was also playing with anatomy, but sort of in an abstract way than I was used to. So we were developing this to create a skin that became an interactive interface. So all the models were nude. We also were doing projection on the side of the Dali Museum in collaboration with Tez Marinucci. And then came my undergraduate thesis. So for that, when I studied abroad in Paris, we had this assignment that was like, you know, dream big. What kind of project would you want to do if you could like really do a really grand scheme? And I was like, oh, I want to build a printer that could print Venus de Milo. So she was found in 2 parts. So I was like making the dimensions that way I could print her in these 2 parts. So the machine stands about 9 feet tall and has a clay hopper of 80 pounds. So this project was sort of ongoing. So at the thesis show, we just had these shelves, and as the printer would print the objects, we would put those objects on display, including the failures. Because for me, I often really love the failures because then I feel like it becomes a collaboration between me and the machine. And there's this level of unexpectedness that I really like. So for instance, like here's the layer deposition. This was before it was a little bit more fine-tuned, but just to get an idea of how the coils are sort of set up. I personally really like fat nozzles, like big nozzles. But here's some of the samples from that thesis show. The piece in the middle, for instance, the layer height was off. So as it continued up, the layers were really thick at the bottom, really thin at the top, which made the object thicker at the top, which made it dry slower. So then I was getting these gradients of color because the objects were live drying. So it was like this interesting element that emerged in the process. And I feel like my favorite parts are always the ones that are unexpected. Like here, you'll see a void. This was before I de-aired the clay. So there's like bubbles and different artifacts that sort of express the narrative of what the clay was like and how the machine was processed. Here's a bubble popping, for instance. So this is like a little spiral curl with like a little explosion because there was a bubble coming through the printer. So just trying to exhibit all those failures in a way that just highlights those imperfections as the strongest parts about the piece. This was the first thing the printer ever squeezed out. It's probably my favorite object I own because it was so difficult for me to get the printer working that when this was squeezed out, I was just so happy about it. So like for me, this is like on my nightstand. I stopped putting it in shows and stuff because I was worried that anything would happen to it. But for me, it was like, this was supposed to be a cylinder, and it's definitely not. But for me, if it was a cylinder, I probably wouldn't have loved it so much. So it's covered in 24 karat gold luster, which is pretty extra, but I feel like this is one of those objects that's just important to me. And then I was using the clay printer hose to sort of extrude these different forms because, long story short, I went through this Facebook event where Milo Yiannopoulos bashed my thesis and said, oh, because I'm a female and an artist, I plagiarized the work and I stole it from somebody else because I couldn't have made that. Which was really hard for me because like the art department knew it was my project because I was creating it in the studio. And then the engineering department investigated my thesis. And after investigating it, they were like, oh, okay, this is fine. Like you can pass and everything. And for me, it was just really hard because it blew up. I didn't know who he was before the event, but after the event, I realized who he was, and he's since been banned from Facebook and other things like that. But I got a lot of hate mail and terrible things that were sexist and awful. But out of that came a lot of art opportunities because the United Nations contacted me about a gender equality event in Tampa and wanted me to create something using the machine. So I created these objects because that's just how I felt. It was like this knot, kind of like your intestines in a way, or this feeling in your stomach. And they're pink for feminism. They're soft, they're flocked, but they're ceramics. So they're these soft objects that look flexible, but they're solid as a rock. Like I wasn't using a nozzle, so they're completely solid clay. So it had to be a really slow drying process. And then that brings me to some of my more recent work. This is Nexus. You can visit it at USF St. Pete in their STEM lab. Essentially, I was trying to create something that utilized reaction diffusion patterns found in nature. So these patterns echo from our brains to brain coral to aerial views of the planet. And though I'm not a religious person, I definitely think there's something going on here. And these echoes of patterns that are through the micro and macro scale is kind of this reason that I make stuff that deals with nature, because for me, that's how I'm able to express this feeling of wonder and surprise about the world around me. So here's sort of this, it's like a blown glass doorknob because it was a door when it was fully assembled. There's my brother Nick, he's here today, helping me out again, my right-hand man. So it was printed out in 8 pieces and I assembled it on site. And I often try to hide words or something in the work. So here's my last name sort of hidden in one of the sections, like Piracci, as a way of sort of hiding things that I don't think anyone's going to find that on their own, but like I know it's there. So it's just like these little things. So this is it in the lobby, sort of on this stoop, and it's a doorway because they were creating this new STEM program. And I wanted to look at it as like an opportunity. So like this is a doorway and these students sort of come in through this space to create with technology and wanted to use the patterns found in nature to be another symbol of a portal. So for me, portals are really important because I think it alludes to another world, whether it be through imagination, a literal portal, a door. Doorways are also commonly in my dreams. So I think that is significant. And then some of the experimentation I've been doing lately is with mushrooms. So fungus is playing a huge role in the world. And I think it's just now really catching on for researchers to take it on as a bigger project in terms of its applications for clothing, building materials. It grows extremely fast. It has a lot of applications. So here you'll see some of the studies that I was doing with germinating spores. So it goes from the orange is the spore itself. The middle shot is a dikaryote. So once the spore is sort of starting to split off, and then once it develops the mycelium here on the right. And then so I was creating these different molds and these mixtures that I could then grow mushrooms out of. So this was just sort of a study that I'm sort of trying to build on to get to another point in my project. So there's so much going on in the world that we don't see. Energies, electricity, things that we can't necessarily measure, but people are measuring them in different ways and having them translated in different art forms. So for instance, this is a mushroom synth, and I'll just show a little clip of it, and then I'll talk about why I'm interested in it. So essentially what's happening is they're using the mushroom as the resistor. So it's kind of like an oscillation circuit where the mushroom, the energy sort of travels through the mushroom. It is read back as feedback. So for instance, if you were to clip this to your fingers, you'll get similar feedback because it's sort of programmed with different thresholds. But like if I clip it to my finger, I'll get similar results, but they're very different. If I cut the mushroom while I have the synthesizer on it, it will change dramatically. And there's these electrical signals happening all underground. That is how plants, for instance, like pass nutrients back and forth. So I'm really interested in exploring a way of expressing that physically, because it's something that we can't see, but it's happening all around us, and it's influencing plants, trees, and all sorts of things. So even with trees, for instance, like the World Wide Web of mycelium, for instance, is like roots of trees are encapsulated with mycelia. The fruiting mushrooms is just one part of fungus that people recognize, but really underground mycelia is everywhere, and that's how plants transfer different nutrients. There are some really interesting studies. So this is a younger oyster mushroom. So to gain more knowledge about the medium, I was just sort of growing mushrooms in my apartment during quarantine and learning about them and trying to figure out how I can print this material. Because with paste deposition printing, I can sort of blend up this gook, basically. I thought this looked like this guy, and extrude it out. So I've been doing different material testing to try to get growable extrusions. So that includes recycled sawdust, recycled Amazon boxes, germinated spores, all sort of blended up. And for instance, like this grew here, like this, like 3 days after being extruded. So mushrooms do grow really fast. They take up the volume of water and sort of turn it into their body. And the mushrooms that you see fruiting, you can't really imagine all the networks that are underground. So for instance, the mycorrhizal fungi that are in tree roots, that's what trees use as a symbiotic relationship to pass nutrients to other trees. So for instance, if you, like there's a lot of studies, if you're interested in this, you could read Secret Life of Trees or Mycelium Running. They talk about this sort of World Wide Web network. But for instance, trees, they can track that they give nutrients to the saplings around them, but they give more nutrients to their own saplings. So it's kind of this question of like, are plants thinking? Are they processing? Do they care about their offspring? Or is it more so just easier genetically to pass nutrients to these things? So it's this idea of trying to get inside the head of these plants, because there's always these electrical signals going on. And if you hook up that same synthesizer to a cactus, you don't get anything. And you can hook it up to an orchid, you might get a little bit. If you're watering the orchid or you're putting sort of nutrients, you'll get more because of the capacitance changing. But my goal that I'm working towards, so this is just sort of like an experiment that I'm working on right now. KJ has showed me a lot with pneumatic robotics with soft silicones. So one of my goals is to sort of create these forms that use the input from the mushrooms, similar to how the synthesizer does, as a mode of expression and movement. So using that as feedback. And I mean, these are just studies, and we're sort of worked into the core sample project as well, but I'm working towards sort of using that electronic signal within trees or mushrooms and sort of translating that into a physical actualization of these sort of plant expressions. And so this is just like a clip. This is KJ's mechanism, basically, that I used as a learning tool, and he's been really gracious in sort of sharing all of his experiences and how to do these sort of mold making activities. Let's see, an MGA sculpture, I worked a lot with mold making. And then so here, sort of making these little air channels to get certain prescribed actuation out of the like mushroom inspired geometries, but not necessarily mushrooms. So the idea would be to hook one of these up to like the oscillation circuit and then use the feedback from that input to be the output of these actuations. So that way the movement is sort of being translated through what's happening in the plant electronically. And I'm not sure what form that takes yet, but I want to show the different changes. So like if you're cutting the mushroom, if you're watering the mushroom, when the mushrooms are dying, for instance, if you click or if you hook up those same synthesizer diodes, they're basically from like a tens unit that can sense electrical signal. The dead mushrooms say less, you know, the really dead mushrooms don't say anything at all. So it is measuring sort of this electrical signal, and I want to just find ways to personify that, whether it's through biosonification or soft robotics. I'm still exploring, but I just thought it'd be interesting to share the progress on that project as well. Thanks for listening, guys. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Tina. That was most excellent and fascinating. We're going to hold questions just till the very end. So please keep your questions, folks. Really, really exciting talk, and what a breadth of work that you have. So I'm going to bring up my screen here. Okay, so thank you, Tina, who you just heard from. And now we're going to hear from Kenny Jensen. And I'll read a brief bio on Kenny as well. And then we'll also hear about your works and then do some Q&A at the end. So Kenny Jensen is a multidisciplinary artist living with his wife, Maggie, and young son, Cedar, in St. Petersburg, here in St. Pete, Florida, and their family, and also on their family land that they refer to as the Floating Woods, which is in rural Gulf Hammock, Florida. Jensen's move has been involved in the Tampa Bay area art community as a professional artist, preparator and art handler, and also curator and grassroots organizer for the past 20 years. And he has a diverse creative background, which includes painting, sculpture, photography, site-specific installations, video work and graphic design work, as well as music composition and performance art. So Kenny, without any further ado, we'll hand it over to you. So I'm going to stop sharing. And let's see. Can't hear you though.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Great.
All right. All right. So I'm on. Well, thank you very much for having me. Okay, Transmit, this is exciting. That was really exciting to hear about Tina's practice. And one really cool fact that we discussed prior to is that we both have work on the campus of USF St. Pete dealing with patterns in nature. So that's been pretty cool. So what I want to do is I want to give you a tour of my studio, which is basically a giant curiosity cabinet. And the reason why I want to give you a tour rather than just exclusively show you images is because a lot of what I'm going to talk about is just easier to share with you. It would be nice if we could all be here in person. That's not the situation right now. So I'm going to try to do the next best thing. So I'm going to start out by just kind of telling you a little bit about myself and some background in my practice while I'm showing you my studio. And then I'm going to show you some of the actual work that I've made out of that, developing that practice. So as Mikhail alluded to, my practice involves a lot of stuff, a lot of making. And a lot of that making in the past has involved direct use of technology. and I went to school for painting and graphic design. And so I did graphic design for quite a while, and as well as video production. So I was really interested in video, both in a gallery sense, but also in narrative filmmaking. And I got to the point where I was no longer satisfied working on my computer. And so I started branching out more, just using things that, or using materials that I could, work with my hands, and focus on that. So my background is I'm a Florida native, and I grew up mostly in St. Pete. And in addition to my time here in St. Pete, around the time I was born, my grandparents got land in the Nature Coast area of Florida called Gulf Hammock. And I grew up spending a lot of our vacations on this land. And so let me show you a little about this land as I'm talking to you here. I'm gonna flip the screen here. So these are actually some photographs that my grandmother took. She recently passed away. She was an excellent photographer. And so this is my grandparents in front of the cabin, which my grandfather built all by himself. This is the process here. And while they were building the cabin, they're like, hey, what are we gonna do with this big hole? Like, let's make a pool and then we can swim in it while we're building all this. And then he also built a barn. You can kind of see it better here. And when I was my whole childhood, I watched him build, as you can see in the background, I watched him build this 53-foot long by 3-story tall giant ferro cement boat. So about 18 years of my life, I watched him build that. It's an artwork I made with him inside of it. So at an early age, I was exposed to making as just a way of living, as a way of being. I'm gonna do kind of like a once around the studio here. And then I'm gonna talk about some of the stuff that you're seeing. So where my work intersects with technology, specifically my background, my family background, my father is an engineer, and so was my grandfather. So what I want to do is kind of show you as a child growing up, what technology was to me was these actual physical objects. How long has it been since you've seen these guys? I don't know if I could still get that off of those. So I grew up just seeing the actual physical objects. And so I've always been a lifelong collector. So in addition to these discarded detritus of obsolete technology, I've also been collecting for a long time, kind of equally strange and bizarre natural forms. So I started collecting these kind of overlooked, forgotten forms, and I started to see these parallels between the forms, between these natural things, these kind of overlooked, discarded, natural, decaying things, with this obsolete technology that is almost like a sculpture now. This at one time did something, I'm sure, but now it's just a beautiful sculpture. And so I wanted to tell you also, in addition to this exposure, I've also always been very attracted to literature, fiction, and specifically science fiction. As a young child, I was very influenced by the Space Trilogy by C.S. Lewis and other works. And within that, reading these books, the technology almost became a metaphor for me. Oh, it was a way of like thinking about my life and my connection to the world and how we were in the world. And there's this one book in particular, this science fiction novel from the 50s. And I'll turn around for a second here, called Can of Coal for Leibowitz. And the premise in the book, you don't know at first, but it's this post-apocalyptic, post-nuclear war scenario in this desert. And one of the main characters is a monk at this really obscure, out of the way monastery. And he goes on this vision quest, and he stumbles into this cave and finds these remnants of technology. And so what had happened in that culture is, after the nuclear holocaust, those that remained, those that were still alive, they kind of did this cleanse. They cleansed all knowledge, everything from academia, especially technology, and any record of technology, any blueprints were burned. Everything was destroyed back to like medieval level. And so the monks, their role became to salvage whatever remnants they could find of these leftover circuit boards and schematics. And what they did is they built, they created illuminated manuscripts out of these remnants that they found. And from that, the culture rebuilt itself, and the technology was remade, and you can guess what happened as a result. So it's a cautionary tale, but for me, the idea that this, and here's some hand-rendered schematics that done by my grandfather, or whoever. And so for me, like, I have a cursory understanding of schematics and how to read them and what, but it's pretty basic. But for me, it's always been about the pattern, about the connections, the language of technology. This here is the first thing my father made when he was studying to be an electrical engineer. And so from that kind of idea that was presented in that fiction, where technology was this metaphor for and actually literal sign of like progress and development. And so I told you about that boat earlier. The boat that my grandfather built, he eventually launched in 2001. And unfortunately, he's over 18 years of building it, he just kept adding stuff on top of the fact that it was a ferro cement boat. I mean, it's utter genius. And for me, it's just a genius work of art. But it ended up sinking, and it got really battered in Hurricane Gene, and it never recovered. So it's actually still, and I'm going to show you some images, but it's still sunk at the bottom of, you can kind of see it, of this river near the land. And so what I did, I found in that boat, I found this covering to the cushions that were in the pilot house. So after the pilot house kind of decayed and collapsed, I found this pattern. I actually found these patterns all over the entire interior of the boat. It's just taken up by this mycelium network of mold growth. And so what I did, this is the most time-consuming work of art I've ever done. When I say it took me months, I don't mean over the course of months. It took me months of actually working on it. So what I did is I highlighted the pattern, and what I did is I painted out everything that wasn't the pattern. And while I did this, I reflected and listened to books and just thought about the patterns themselves. And this kind of started a whole body of work. And so I started to see patterns everywhere. Let me real quick show you a little bit. So I started to notice patterns everywhere. I noticed that, for instance, almost every tree in the forest, the upper branches are covered in absolute forests and forests of lichen. So there's these like continents, undiscovered continents on each branch of every tree in the forest. And then, there's a lot of firewood, you make fires in the forest. There was a time when I took this piece of wood and I went to throw it in the fire and the bark fell off. And I saw this pattern because I was starting to be attuned to recognize these patterns. And I started to see them everywhere. And these patterns are made by bark beetles. And what is happening here is the mature beetle bores out this channel and lays little eggs in there. And so what happens is each of these little lines, it looks very motherboard like. Each one of these lines represents one individual path of a beetle larva eating their way out to come out to the tree and go presumably kill more trees. But around the time that pattern I showed you from the boat, I was working on that. I was living in San Diego with my sister, and I noticed this book on her shelf, and I saw this pattern. I was like, what is this? And this book got me thinking about chaos theory and fractals, and it really got me down this path. And so I started to integrate these patterns that Tina was talking about, the world, the wood wide web is what they call it. And so I took these patterns and I started reflecting on the idea that what we know about these creatures is just what they've consumed in this material. So we can trace their life based only on what they've consumed, what they've erased. And so I started making lots of art with these patterns, and then I wanted to kind of bring it to a human scale to think about it more in terms of how do we move through the world? How do I move through the world? What is my path that is represented by how I consume, how I use, how I interact with the world around me? So I'm gonna share my, whoa, speaking of technology, watch out. So what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna share my screen to show you some of the results of that. Thanks for waiting. Okay. Can you all see that?
Looks good.
Cool.
Yep.
Okay. So this installation is about 20 feet long. And I'm gonna, so you can kind of see there's a depth to it. So this is from that pattern that I showed you in that branch. So I flattened it out into 2 dimensions. So I took the the form that was in the circumference of the stick, and it kind of tells a story. So I'm interested in, and part of the reason why there's the coloration that I selected is there, when I don't want that. So again, here's the stick that I use as a reference. And part of why I chose that coloration, I'm sorry, bear with me, because is that what's implied above all these color connections, which we don't see. So you see how the colors are blending, and there's all this form that's not there. So it's like an inversion of that form. What was a negation becomes like this positive form, and so it became a reflection on just how we do interact with the world, how we connect with our surroundings. Let's see here. So I guess I'm gonna switch back now. Stop sharing. Okay. All right, can you all, do I need to do a share
Yep.
screen again?
No, you're back.
Okay,
On the
cool.
phone. Yeah.
Okay.
Kenny, you're muted right now, man.
Thank you, thank you. So I began to see this connection between the patterns that I would see. So here we have, this is an artwork made by an individual with special needs that I used to work with. This is this is another bark beetle pattern. This is some decayed bark that fell off a dead mangrove tree. This is a leaf miner pattern. You can see each individual path that is overlapped here. It starts here at this point, and when it expands slowly, and then you can see where they transformed and exited the leaf. So I want to talk a little bit more about the role of literature in books and how I have connected with the world. So as Tina was mentioning, there's a lot of resources to read about the topics of this. In particular, there's this book, The Integral Life, that I've been reading. And this is a really good resource on learning about the Wood Wide Web and how connected fungal networks are to everything. This book, The Overstory, that's another fictional account, but it heavily references the secret life of trees and other aspects of learning about our connection to old growth forests. And there's an author I really like who is from Florida, and I just finished his most recent book, but I highly recommend those as well. His works, especially Born, has had a real influence on how I see the connection of the natural world with technology. His works have really inspired this kind of ecstatic reality, these objects that have taken on this kind of second life, this second nature, this ecstatic. These are all things I've found in the forest and altered in some ways. So that's a little bit of a tour of my studio. What I'm working on right now is this amazing space. Unfortunately, I'm gonna have to leave very soon, so that we can kind of fast track to go to the cabin. We're gonna have to kind of cut back and save up to be able to go there. So our plan is to actually move full time to that land, and that will be my studio space. I'm gonna share one more time real quick to show you some of that. But so I've been working on paintings because that's something I'll be able to do when I'm in this new space without all this large work area. So I'm doing some paintings of lichen patterns that I've found in the forest. And also I'm doing these portraits of individual chunks of grass from my front yard. These are all underpaintings at this point. So I'm gonna share the screen one more time. So I don't know if you can everyone see and hear?
Yep, it's coming
Cool.
through.
Cool. So this is the cabin. This is the boat I was talking about. I'm just gonna. So this idea of like the things that once meant so much, the things that were, you know, represented, you know, hopes and dreams and just what life could be, like seeing it framed in a different way and kind of taken over, almost like it's become a part of the swamp. It's become like second nature. So this is what the cabin looks like now. And this is, it's surrounded by swamp on all three sides. And this is really lovely field in which my wife is we're gonna have a farm. And in that barn that my grandfather built, we're gonna eventually start an artist residency. And so artists will come and live in the cabin, and there'll be a little studio space there, but then there'll be a large barn. Let me show you those images. Yeah, so here's the barn. And that work that I showed you, the 20-foot long installation, I actually made in this space. I have a new project that I eventually want to work at the cabin. We're just gonna go to here. That'll be for another time. So I currently have a show at Hillsborough Community College, and it's a group show entitled Engulfed, and it features artists, regional artists that all work with ideas of sustainability and climate change, and just climate collapse, and how our behavior and our habits and our the way we move through the world affects each other and the environment. So this piece is called The Understory, and it's very much about thinking about some of the stuff that Tina was talking about, and how the forest is so dependent on each other and how they communicates with this underground network. And so I saw, in thinking about the idea of engulfed, so I started thinking about how there's in some ways kind of a void. There's kind of a void of humanity in the natural world now. Like we've removed ourselves, like, because we are nature, and how we view ourselves really, and how we behave in the world really affects how we view ourselves, and how well we can connect to each other, ourselves, and nature. So here's one more view. So this show is actually up until I guess it's tomorrow. So if you're, it's a really cool show. The other art is just fantastic. But yeah, so that's just kind of a little sample. That's my most recent work, in addition to this new painting series I'm doing. But I'm gonna stop sharing. And I'm gonna go back to, well, that was a good opportunity to share what's happening in my studio, and to talk about things I don't really normally get to talk about in relation to the context of what role technology does have in my life and in my work. It's probably a little bit different than a lot of artists that speak in this forum. I'm not often directly using, but just using kind of antiquated technology as a way to think about what the role of technology itself is. So reflecting a lot on that. But yeah, so my website has a lot of material. It also has some interviews and some artist talks of me giving kind of detailed explanations about a lot of the works that I have there. So it's a really good resource. So I appreciate you allowing me to kind of give this performance in this space and kind of reveal some things, and just by showing it and talking about it helps me actually think about it and realize things as well. So yeah, I look forward to hearing the questions. I'm pretty good at conversation. It's hard just a one-way conversation, rambling in my studio space that I'm often losing my mind in. But yeah, thank you so much for having me and your patience to listening. And I look forward to continuing the conversation very much.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you, Kenny. That both Kenny and Tina, extremely fascinating, and I think for both of you, like there's so much interesting overlap. Pairing you in the same meetup was, I think, intuitive more than anything, and it's kind of interesting to think about intuition and art. And one thing that has occurred to me is that you both kind of are using art as a lens for exploring. And it's almost like how scientists approach work, but with sort of the freedom to create and cross disciplines and cross sort of whatever you need to kind of get to like these insights and answers. And I think is kind of a fascinating similarity, and also how you're both kind of discovering and finding these different patterns in nature and then exploring those patterns. And it's also fascinating, like there's a communion with nature in both of your works. Also, yeah, so I'd like to hear a little bit more about that. Like it almost goes beyond just representation, like it's a lot of artists will kind of be inspired by nature and represent nature in their work, like depicting, say, a landscape or something. But I think it's also a different thing here. It's like another level of going further into the narrative of it. There's a narrative motif and kind of an imaginary exploration. But like for instance, Tina, in your case, there's like augmentation of nature, like sort of reconstructing nature, reconstructing habitat, almost like creating a function with the pieces in nature. So maybe you want to, do either of you want to kind of comment on that, sort of using art as a lens to explore?
Sure. I definitely would like to talk about that. I like the word lens that you're using. I actually, I have a whole body of work where I create these little boxes, little diorama boxes. Let me turn this around. And it's very much, this is normally plugged in with an LED, but I'm going to use this.
I was wondering what those were. I thought they were cameras.
Yeah. So you can kind of see, so when you walk up to it, it kind of catches your eye. So the lens kind of pulls you in. It's hard with this Apple lens. But that's what all these are. And I'm actually working on a whole series of them. I collect lenses, by the way. But yeah, it's very much, you can see, and also, again, antiquated technology, these old cameras, take an old projector. But very much, yes, it's very much art is in a similar way that I think technology can be. It's a, I kind of see it more as like literature, where it creates this setting of like an ecstatic reality, which allows space to reflect. It allows dialogue. It allows you to see connections that you might not see otherwise. So there's one thing for me to walk around. I've been a lifelong naturalist, so I've walked around the woods, but the more that I notice and start making art out of things, it becomes this like trigger, like this ingrained thing. It almost like opens up this new pathway. It's almost like exponential, and it branches out, similar to the mycelia, interaction underground and roots and fractals. And so you start to notice things more, and you can't unnotice them. And so then it becomes this kind of need and desire to share, because there's this wonder when you start seeing everything, just almost like everything is foreground. It all becomes alive, and and in the scene, you realize you are an integral part of that. And so your presence in your, the actual like identity itself, it has a connection, a mysterious meaning wrapped up in the natural world. And so I think the art, not only is it just a way of sharing, but it's also a way of understanding. Almost, it's a conversation. I tend to, in speaking, I tend to think more. So in having a conversation with someone, and so it's similar in nature, by action, by dwelling, by being present, and then taking that and making something out of that. It then deepens that interaction and connection, and creates more potential for what I can share. And for me, it's really very much about what's valued. What do we value? And so that's why so much of my work is centered on these kind of forgotten, lost, utterly unvaluable things, but where is the beauty in it? In what, if paying attention to these small, insignificant things, what can be gained from that? What kind of presence can we learn? And so for me, it also has a function to, it's almost has like a prophetic kind of function as well, where it's like, look at what's being lost, but look at how wonderful what we have is. There's this book on my counter over there. It's called All We Can Save. And so it's this tone of like, even though these things are forgotten and lost, look at the beauty that can be drawn out of them. And almost the more ordinary, the better. The more mundane, the more that power there can be innate within it to provide wonder. That's why I'm doing portraits of like little tiny clumps of lawn. It's like it's our most immediate connection to nature. We step outside of our house and we're grounded. And it's just a way. It's like a portal, as Tina was saying. It's a portal into a broader understanding, a broader intention of being in nature. And I think the artist has that kind of potential to be able to provide that lens, as you say, and create that space to help people see more value and more connection to the world around them in a way that hopefully would inspire more love, more desire to preserve and to care.
Cool. It's a good insight and answer. Well, Tina, how about you? Do you think of your arts practice as, do you kind of see yourself as a scientist exploring through the lens of art, or how do you approach that?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like everything is an experiment, and with changing different bodies of work so many times, sometimes I feel like it's hard to sort of centralize everything. But just even touring through Kenny's studio and just being like, wow, we have a lot of the same stuff in our studio, and just like these little elements that are just repeating. And like, I mean, I'm sure my brother who's here today on James's screen can atone to me just like collecting random nature things always, and just having like boxes of stuff that have like beetle carvings or leaves, or like my fridge has leaves on it, like just like random things that inspire me, because it's those little things that you see sort of repeating throughout your life, or like deja vu or dreams, like all these little magical moments that really just give me inspiration to live. And I feel like in our current time, like nature is sort of being swallowed up by humanity with pollution and overpopulation and all sorts of problems that are happening. So for me, I'm really interested in how those overlaps between humans and nature can have like a scientific underlying between them, like when I go outside and, take a hike, am I like honestly happier and feel better because there's like some kind of direct gas exchange happening between like me and the plants, or like these just like little things that that people are starting to develop tools to analyze, and like seeing how plants communicate and how different things communicate, and just sort of comparing that to our lives. And I feel like with technology, sometimes it's not helpful, I mean, I feel like sometimes technology distances us from each other. So to use it as a tool to try to explore those concepts and try to think about, why do aerial views of the planet look like what's inside my body, or like why are these things repeating? It just kind of gives me hope. I think especially in my generation, like it's just so many people are starting, like there's more degree programs, for instance, that are sustainability and like focused on like trying to fix all of the planet's problems. And I feel like there's always been issues, but it's kind of just in decline with global warming and everything. So to explore these notions, maybe as a scientist in part at the lab, I feel like I can sort of balance reason and ridiculousness. Like when I'm doing the mushroom studies in the architecture department, you know, my professors are just like, oh, that's nice. You know, like, what is this about really, you know? Whereas when I do the same presentation in the art practice department, they go crazy and they love it. So it's like just looking through different lenses and seeing what different groups of people can relate to and what they can connect to. Like the Nexus piece was all about connection and overlap. And I think grouping Kenny and I together was awesome. I mean, I couldn't stop smiling when you started walking through your studio because I was just like, we're hoarders. We've got all these things that are so similar. You know, I've got so many.
We're scientists.
Yeah, yeah, let's call it that.
That's a better word. Yeah.
Yeah.
Really
But no, it
important.
was inspiring to see everything in there because it's just nice to know that people are also listening to things while they're making and sort of trying to flesh that out and ask these questions of like, why is this like that? Or why are these representations sort of just echoing throughout? Because for me, that's what's most inspiring and gives me hope for like the future and like the planet's going to be okay. And, you know, the connections we make with people are going to be strengthened through things like this.
Yeah, totally. I think you guys are both onto something because, you know, you mentioned connection, and I think about, okay, with technology and all of the kind of data visualization and data analysis and ways of measuring that we have at our disposal, it doesn't necessarily mean that it develops an emotional response inside of us towards the planet. You know, it's just a bunch of information. But if you can't relate to it and you can't connect with it and you can't have a feeling about it, it's arbitrary. It doesn't actually, it's sort of lost on us. So it does feel important as an artist to have this function where you're like finding small things and elevating it to the status of appreciation, which seems like a sort of prerequisite to working on big planetary issues in the first place.
For sure.
Does anyone else, would anyone else like to ask Kenny or Tina a question?
I would. Tina, I'm Rod.
Hi, Rod.
Hi. My basic question for you is one of technology. The very first things you showed us was of clay, where you were using it to make objects. The question is, could that be the process enlarged so you actually could build walls of houses with it, like maybe using concrete and sand rather than clay?
Yeah, absolutely. That's being done right now. Even in Texas, for instance, they've got whole communities of cement 3D printed houses. The person I came to Berkeley to work for, Ron Rael, the work that we were developing was printing with Adobe. So we were literally just like shoveling mud, adding water and hay and running it through the printer with a larger nozzle. So the nozzle is more like this.
Right.
And it's sort of just layer by layer. With that process, because it's all natural materials, there's no catalysts in it. So we have to sort of print it over time. So it's like, you know, 5 days to get like a really tall structure. Whereas with the cement processes, they can print a house in 24 hours. There's different organizations like New Story Charity, for instance, based out of San Francisco, that use it as a way to combat homelessness because in a lot of different areas, you know, like it's just expensive to construct housing, and then so it becomes not achievable for some people. So what this company does is brings a machine to a place that's suffering from a lack of housing and using local materials to build structures for these people that don't have homes. So with the, like, there's this argument of like, oh, are robots stealing jobs? And it's like, yeah, the construction people that would be making those houses aren't able to sort of get that job, but now someone's able to have a house because it's affordable because they can't. So it's sort of controversial, but like, I can't help but to argue for technology in instances like that because we're advancing, we're allowing for more time for other things. So like, I just feel like with projects like New Story Charity and even like the projects we've been doing with Ron, where we're really just like shoveling mud, running it through a machine and producing an object with it. Like with the stoves, for instance, like they're still able to use their traditions. And I've even gotten some pushback from that because like the developmental engineering classes I take at Berkeley, they want to make sure that we're not being invasive to anybody's traditions, but with these programs, it's usually people that have come to us that are interested for the technology. So it's not like we're like trying to force it on them or anything. But yeah, you can, anything that you can reduce to a paste, you can print.
Could you spell the name of that San Francisco group for me, please?
Yeah, it's New Story Charity. I can go ahead and put it in the chat.
Oh, good. Thank you. I don't hear as well as I used to. So. Oh, gotcha. Thank you.
And the company that makes the printers is Icon 3D. So New Story Charity uses Icon 3D's printers, but Icon 3D is also like a commercialized business that print the cement houses. For instance, there's like a whole village in Texas.
Yeah.
They're a little bit more posh and upscale, but like it's the company that designs the machines.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Cool. Well, I think this probably is a good stopping point, and this is recorded, so there may be more chatter on our website for our Meetup webpage afterwards. We have a dialogue that usually kind of expands after our meetups with sort of asynchronous questions and answers. So you may get pinged by someone if you're on there later. But yeah, this was really fascinating, and I'm so happy that you both could join us tonight to share about your practice. So big thank you.
Thanks
And
for having us.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you, everyone who joined.
If I wanted to post, or if I wanted to share, like my website, you know, my social information, and I have a blog right now through Creative Knowledge. So I just put it on the notes for this on the Meetup site.
Yeah, absolutely. And we can post it in the original description as well. I think we have some information there already.
Oh, great.
We'll add the blog as well if you want to share that. Yeah, excellent.
Cool.
Very cool. And I just added a link in the chat if you guys are interested in seeing the group Emerging Objects that built those mud huts. So this is like Dzane did an article on it, but it's basically just mud. But that's the specific example in Colorado with the guy I worked for.
Thanks. You. All right. Thank you, everyone, and have a great night. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks.
Bye, everybody.